Okay.
Okay.
We're rolling.
All right. Well, I first came to Grand Lake Stream on November 1st of 1946 on a deer hunting trip with my dad and his friends. I was 11 years old, and my father went to the school, which was taught by Dominican nuns, and said, "Give me Edward's assignments for the next 2 weeks. He's going hunting." And those were good old days, so they did, and away we went. We all came from Newburgh, New York, in the Hudson Valley, which is about 60 miles north of New York City. And the drive was quite a drive in those days. There were no interstates. It took about 3 days to get across, traveling on Route 2 and things like that. It was just fascinating for a 12-year-old. I actually was 11 that year. And I would travel with my father and his very close friends. There were 4 of them that were involved in the deer camp. My father and a gentleman named Archie Stewart, whose father in turn had founded the camp, the Stewart Camp, at the thoroughfare on West Grand. I think he located it in 1926. And he was one of my father's very close friends, and the other 2 close friends were a doctor named Proper and a lawyer named George Northrop. And the 4 of them, my father and the other 3, were close friends for life, really, and they are buried in a row with their wives on a hill in Newburgh, New York right now. They just remain close friends their whole lives. And the journey was amazing. I can recall being in LL Bean late in the night on one of the trips up. It was a 2-story wooden frame building, and the old adage is true. Leon Bean stayed up all night during deer hunting season, and you could meet him on the floor. I actually met the gentleman as we were sorting through clothes and things, so that was a regular stop on that trip. It terminated in Grand Lake Stream when we would all pile onto one of the logging boats then, and towing Grand Laker canoes, head up to the Stewart Camp for the 2-week deer hunt. The biggest difference between then and now, physically, is that in those days, in the late 40s and early 50s, there were no roads here. There was the road into town, and that was it. You traveled by water on the lakes. The roads, such as they were the haul roads in the woods that were used in the logging camps, and they were the users of them were strictly horses and sleds, so that they made ideal hunting grounds. The logging camps themselves were mostly still intact, and the roads in and out of them would be grown up in grass in the season, and they made for great hunting. The downside of it was every morning when you went out hunting in November, you were going to do a cold ride in the Grand Laker, sometimes cracking ice as you headed across Pecumpas Lake or headed down West Grand. But it was magical for me. I think the deer camps of the 30s, 40s, and 50s were one of Maine's major, wonderful institutions. There were many of them around the state. There are still a few. But they were places where friends gathered every year and spent a week or 2 in the woods, sort of getting away from all of the things that were in their ordinary lives. You had a dentist, a doctor, and a lawyer, and a surgeon who didn't shave once they hit the camp for 2 weeks. But they always arrived in Grand Lake Stream in overcoats and regular fedora hats, and would change before they went up lake. And the party was always the 4 of them, plus assorted friends from Newburgh. that would, so that the party each year would perhaps involve 8 or 9 hunters and 4 or 5 guides, plus one of the greatest institutions that Maine has ever known, the woods cooks, who after hunting season went into the woods and cooked all winter in the logging camps. And they were very redoubtable people with whom you did not want to mess. They ruled with an iron fist, which you can imagine would be necessary if you were spending the winter with 30 or 40 guys who were pretty rough characters. So they were wonderful cooks too, I might add. So that the meals were wonderful, and the camaraderie was terrific. The guides and the hunters just sort of all blended together because they had, spent some years together. I think my father first went hunting there in 1934 or 35, and Wes Stewart, who was Archie Stewart's father and Newberg's Buick dealer, had found and located the camp in 1926. And those folks in those early years didn't come in through Grand Lake Stream. They came from Perry, and they came up through the lake system, the Machias lakes and streams, and down Dobsey, and then to the Stewart camp. In fact, the first 2 guides in those early years were not from Grand Lake Stream. They were from Perry. One was named Howard Kendall, and the other was a gentleman named Rob Golding. And I got to know Rob Golding because he still came to the hunting camp as a guest when I was a kid in those hunting parties. He was an amazing hunter and trapper, and a veteran of the Spanish-American War when he was 18 or 19. In any event, he used to take me out every morning on the sand spits and the beaches up there to what he called read the register, which would be to see where the deer had crossed and the other critters that abounded on that part of the lake, because that was the narrowest place there was. The hunting parties themselves usually involved perhaps 4 people and a guide in a party. Sometimes 3, sometimes 2, depending on where you were going. And it was, as I say, there were no roads, so that it really was a wilderness in the sense that you could go a long ways in the woods without ever finding anything that looked familiar to you at all. So the guides were invaluable. There were a lot more deer in the woods in those days than there are now. I don't think we ever left camp without the necessary trophy to bring, and it was different. And, as a kid there, I was sort of a spare attached to my father's party in the woods, and being 11 years old, I was provided with a Winchester rifle, which the caliber of which was called a 25-20, which proved in the end to be neither big enough nor small enough to be a useful weapon, so you don't even see them anymore. And one of the tricks, I never figured this out for years, but one of the tricks to keep me still and not lost was the first guide that took me in the woods, a guide was Val Moore. And Val would say, listen, there are partridge in these woods, and they drum. And you'll hear them drumming. And I want you to sit here. And when you hear them drum, you can move in their direction, but not when they're not. And you'll get a shot if you do that. So he would then leave me where I was sort of pinned down, listening for the drumming partridge, and go off without fear of my straying too far. I figured out years later that it was a scam. to keep me immobilized. But I was just absolutely in love with the woods and all that went with it. We had some interesting adventures. There were very few moose in the country at that time. They had left this country when the heavy logging reduced the open forest, to second growth, and it was difficult for them to maneuver in those woods. And they only finally returned when roads were permitted and the woods opened up some. But we inadvertently and illegally, a moose was killed in that camp. The first fall I was there, by one of my folks' friends, who was a doctor with little hunting experience. He did not realize what he had done. And there was an awful lot of whispering and going on in and around the camp, which was strange to me, for 3 or 4 days. And then finally, at breakfast, these very, very large steaks would appear, as opposed to your ordinary venison steak. These things were outsized. And my father finally said to me, well, Paul killed a moose. He's terrified, and it has been quartered and hidden, and but we're going to eat it, which we did. It was an amazing way, to grow up there. It really was. They had a vehicle they called the Moji at the camp. The Moji was a Model T with steel tracks on the back of it that was used to bring firewood in. And the only problem with the design was that it was pretty smooth steel, and it was treacherous in pine needles. It would just slip and slide all over the place. But that way, it was an amazing machine. The Moji, they called it. And in any event, it was the high point, I think, not only of my life, but my dad's also. The preparations for the hunting trip would start pretty early in the fall, with my dad and all cleaning their guns and assembling stuff and making plans and talking to the head guide became Earl Bonus in those trips, so there would be much palaver back and forth with him. And some of the guides who were on those trips almost all of the time were Val Moore and Hazen Bagley and Carol Gould, all of whom still have relatives in this town and whose families came really in the tannery event that kind of preceded me, but I know about it vividly because there's excellent 16mm footage of it. My Archie Stewart became a big fan of home motion pictures way back in the late 20s, so that he had a 16mm camera, and by the time the party was fully fleshed out, everyone had one. My father had one, George Northrop had one, and there's one scene of them that's in the archives now. They're all standing in the blizzard filming each other. But the event that got filmed that was pretty interesting was that prior to World War II, my father in the group had a friend who shall remain nameless, but he was an Army Air Force general stationed at West Point. And every fall, in the last 4 days of the hunt, he would fly this enormous PBY flying plane up and land it at the thoroughfare. He would then hunt for the last 4 days, the hunt, and then he would load all of the deer onto the plane that were going home, and he'd fly back down to the Hudson River, which West Point is only 10 miles from Newburgh, where we lived. And magically, that venison would be cut, wrapped, frozen, and labeled in the kitchens and mess at West Point. And on one of his trips, as he went to leave, loaded with deer, the lake, as it is today, is always drawn down in the fall to create freeboard for the winter. And when he always had a couple of guys with, there would be crewmen. When they went to pull back the engine, the plane wouldn't, it was stuck in the mud. The floats, it was just down, and he'd gun the motors and the tail would come up. And in the end, they had to attach 3 Grand Lakers to it and tow it back so that he could leave. And there's quite a video record of that little episode somewhere. In fact, I think the Northeast Film Society has it. And that brings really to a close the pre-World War II events. The World War itself halted the trips until it ended. And they did not come during those years. But during those, the final part of the war, they had, the third camp was built just as World War II was about to break out. And I have a picture in the album in there of their first arrival at the camp to see their new domain. There were 3 camps there. And in the window is a sticker that says, "We want Wilkie." That was the last season until the war ended. And when it ended, that's when I came on board. The first season after that, I was brought up there. And after I started coming after the war, the second deer season was 1947. And that summer of 1947, my father and mother started sending my brother and I up here. We would be driven to Boston and put on an overnight train that would wind up in Calais. And Earl Bonus would pick us up at the train station in Calais, bring us to Grand Lake Stream. We'd get in the canoe or the lobster boat and come up, and we would spend 2 or 3 weeks with him alone, and then my parents would come for 2 weeks. And that's how we spent those summers into the mid-50s. And it was just glorious. It really was, because it was just the 2 of us, and a guide who knew every inch of the woods. So we did all kinds of canoe trips, overnight canoe trips. We went, we fished, and every summer we would get a big old hemlock log and do log rolling contests out there. And Earl had started in the woods as a cookee, which is a cook's assistant in a logging camp. You're basically a pot walloper and server and lugging food through the woods and stuff. He then became a river driver, and then what they would call a chopper, which is a tree feller. Okay, I want to go back to the hunting camp again. And one event that was truly memorable to me was we came in 1947 at the same time of year. And if you look at the historical record, there was a massive forest fire in Maine that fall. And it's well documented. It was probably the worst that ever occurred in this part of Maine. And they closed the woods, and it was still ongoing when we arrived. And so you couldn't hunt, but everyone wanted to come anywhere. And old Wes Stewart was still alive at that time, and he would come on the trip, although he had had a stroke and he couldn't hunt, but he just loved being there. But he was an old Scotchman and a pretty formidable guy, and he said there will be no hunting in accordance with the regulation. I don't expect any hunting to take place. So you guys are welcome to, you know, to do whatever you want, to be here. He sort of embargoed all the rifles, and you weren't allowed to do any of that stuff. But there was no camp meet either. So this plan was devised, and one morning, the entire party of hunters and guides filtered out of the camp because they had smuggled a .38 caliber police special pistol, right? And we went into Grand Lake and down to Marks Island, and one of the guides went to the end of the up lake end of the island, and all the rest of us started at the other end and drove the island and killed a doe. I mean, it was a no-brainer. And that was smuggled back to the camp and became the camp meat, carefully working around poor old Wes. But it was an interesting event that from that fire. They later, before we left, they opened the woods, and we were able to hunt a few days. So that's about it for now. The stories could go on for years, but that's enough for a dose.